So now we are on to our penultimate block, block number 11, the attic window. This one's really fun to play with because you can make them, especially if you make an entire quilt out of this, you can what's called fussy cut this square, so you can get things with bigger motifs, with little baby animals or something that you want to make it look like you're looking out of an actual window. And this looks like your window pane. So this looks like the sun that's shining in, and this is the shadow on the edge of your window pane. And when you have them put together in like a 3x4, it really looks like windows. And so that's really fun to do if you have a really unique pattern that kind of has like maybe an outdoor scene or something like that. Then you can be really careful, and by fussy cut, what they mean is you're going to have to cut an 8.5 inch square. And so you're going to look at this and go, okay, this is 8.5 inch. So if I want this picture to be right in the middle, then you're going to line it up in the center, and then you're going to cut right around the picture that you actually want to show in the window. And that way you're cutting out that block. You might be wasting fabric because most quilters want to save every piece of fabric that they can, and so they always try to work from the edge and then work out using their fabric so that they can fit as much on there. When you're fussy cutting, there is more waste because you are being very specific about the part of the fabric that you're cutting out, not just that you have this chunk over here that would fit, but the picture that you're wanting is not going to be in the center. So you have to kind of line it up, and then usually there's a good bit of loss that way. I just used the same fabrics that I had that didn't have any large motifs really, and so I kind of picked the one that looked a little bit like snowflakes, and so I thought it would be kind of fun to make it look like it's snowing outside. And so you're seeing snow outside, and then the warm red of the sashing on the window here. So I chose colors that were similar over here but in different tones. So there's a slightly lighter color in here and a darker color here, but they're both in kind of a pink color. You can make it look however you want, but generally if you want to have the actual effect of a window, you want to do your light color on the bottom where it looks like light is streaming in, so the sun's shining through the window, and a darker color on the side so that you have your shadow. And you want them to be at least sort of similar in color. And you can use fabric that is solid and just tonals of the same color, or you can use prints that read as a different color that have other stuff. It's really just up to you. As usual, you get to make the decision, which is the beauty of quilting, is you get to be the creative part of it. And you just get to use kind of a pattern to kind of set your brain on the goal that you're going after, but not necessarily make it exactly like someone else's. And so the reason this is the almost last one is because it uses a technique called a Y seam. Y like the letter Y, because these are solid pieces here, which means that where this meets, you actually have to fit this square in once there's already seaming here. So you seam here first, and then you have to work both seams around this square. And so it seems terrifying to a lot of sewers to do a Y seam, but it's really not that difficult if you take your time and you mark well. So let me show you how you actually mark for a Y seam. So you're going to cut these. Oh, also I want to point out, let me get my pieces out. This shows you the different colors, and I reversed them on here where the dark's on the bottom, but you know, whatever. It tells you 12 7/8 inches long by 4.5 wide, and then there's a 45-degree cut right here. That makes your angle. It does matter which corner you cut off. So be careful, because I did that a couple times. I got my rectangle cut just like I wanted it, and then I was looking at it, I cut my 45, and then I kept looking at it going, why does it look wrong? And it's because I cut the wrong corner off. Because for the dark one, you have to cut this corner off. For the light one, in this section, normally this would be the dark, but for the lighter blue here, you have to cut this one off so that they meet right there in a mitered seam. So be careful in your cutting and pay attention to which way you have to hold your ruler to cut at 45-degree angle. Most rulers, especially these longer ones like this, they're going to have lines on them that will show you. Let me see if I can get a piece of paper to put behind that so it'll show up a little better. So you have these little lines, and this one tells you it's a 30-degree angle if you start over in this corner and line this up to one edge. So this was a 45-degree angle. This is the one that I needed to use. So what I did was I lined that up with the bottom of my fabric. Well, let me turn it to where I actually cut it off. There we go. To the bottom of my fabric. So that line actually lines up to the very bottom edge of my fabric, and then I cut along this edge, and that makes this a 45-degree cut. And so for this demonstration, what I'm going to show you, I'm going to have a light green down here, I'm going to have a slightly darker green on the side, and I went ahead and used the same blue square there. So the cutting is actually relatively simple once you get the idea of how to cut that 45-degree angle. Let me press this real quick so it will sit a little bit better for me. Same thing here. But what I've got to do is be able to seam these together, and then once they're already together, fit this in there. There are cheater things that you can say, well, I call it cheater, it's just a method that you can use a half square triangle over in this corner and then just do a rectangle here and a rectangle there. That will solve a lot of this Y problem. However, it just doesn't look as good. I think it looks a lot better where you don't have a seam right here cutting off that triangle. I think this looks much better when you learn how to do the Y seam, which is really not that difficult once you start messing with it. So what you need to do is make note of which corners are coming together. So these are the 3 corners I need to mark, and let me show you how to mark those. So I've got them cut to how they're going to be. I've got a pencil. I actually went and found a pencil, and so I need to mark this one and mark it kind of far off so that it's not going to confuse you when you actually have your correct markings on there. But I can at least see which corner I'm supposed to do so that I don't get confused and accidentally mark the wrong corner. So I know this is going to be the corner that has to go together. And so I'm going to take my 1/4 inch line on my ruler, and I'm going to line it up to the edge right here, the shorter edge of it, and then, because this is the edge that's going to touch the square there, and I'm going to mark just a little bit at the end here. I don't need to mark the entire line. If you want to, you can, but we're just going to do a 1/4 inch seam, but I need to know where this stops over here at 1/4 inch. So I mark this point, and then I mark the angle by lining up to my 1/4 inch on that angle right there, and I mark that point. This, where they intersect, is where I have to stop stitching. Whenever I get over to the machine, I'm going to explain it a little bit better and show you exactly what I'm doing. But what you've got to do is we don't go from here all the way down with 1/4 inch. We go well, actually we're going to do this edge first, so this is the first seam here. I'm going to start down here, and I'm going to go and stop right at where those points intersect at my 1/4 inch, because I need this 1/4 inch seam still open so that I can actually manipulate it to be able to fit around that square. So I'm going to do the same thing with my other piece, except it's going to be this corner this time. So I'm going to do my angle 1/4 inch away. I'm going to mark that corner where that's going to intersect, and then along the short long edge, that doesn't make sense, but not this cut, the shorter of the long cuts. So I'm going to line it up to a 1/4 inch there and mark there. And it's easier to go from the middle of the fabric out than it is this way, because that way you're going to grab that bias and kind of stretch it. So it is a better idea just to kind of get used to marking from the inside to the outside of the fabric. And so again, I've got a little X marking the spot where I have to stop. And so the first thing I'm going to do is seam these two together on that angle. So right sides together, pretty sides together. And I'm going to stitch from this tip 1/4 inch all the way down until I reach that point where it crosses, and then I'm going to stop right there. So let's go to the machine. So I'm sorry about that flickering that you're seeing. That's just because my lights on my machine are not at 100%, and so they kind of rotate through because they're LEDs. Your eyes don't see that, but the video camera picks up the difference in the way that the light works. So I'm sorry. I'm sure there is a video way of fixing that. I am not that kind of video expert, so I can't fix that. But I want you to hopefully be able to see exactly what I'm doing here, and so I'm going to try to get a good tight shot and keep my fingers out of the way. So we're just going to do a 1/4 inch seam. I've got my 1/4 inch piecing foot with my little guard on there again. I made sure that I scooted it over to where it's actually a 1/4 inch. And now I'm just going to start sewing from the tip of the point, the pointier part of my 45-degree cut. And I'm going to work my way up. And once I start getting to that pencil line, that tells me that I need to slow down and start paying attention. And I'm going to go very slow because I want to hit it right on that line. And so I need to do one more, and it should get me. And that's also when you can use your hand wheel on your right hand side of your machine. I don't know a machine that does not have a hand wheel. You have your hand wheel, you can do it and just do one stitch so that you know that you're hitting it right where you want to. And I've got it right where I want it to be, so now I'll just hit fix and trim it off. So now, I don't know how well you can see that. I stopped right at this point right here. And so I've still got a bit of an open seam right at the very end. And so that's going to be where my Y seam works out. And so now I'm not going to completely press it, because what I need to do is still be able to manipulate this a little bit better. So I'm going to leave it like it is, and then I'm going to mark my square, and then I'll be back with the square. So now we mark this corner the same way. So 1/4 inch, line it up on that 1/4 inch line right there, and then mark that corner that I'm going to have meet together. Alright, and then we can sew that into the Y seam. So now I have my square marked. I did the same thing, so I went through and I marked it just like I did the others. I can get it right in the spot where it's supposed to be. There we go. So I've got my 1/4 inch marked right there. And now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take one edge. So I'm gonna start with the light one just because that's the one I chose. Oh, no I'm not. I'm gonna start with the dark one because I needed to turn that around. So this should match up just right at the edge there. But what's gonna happen is I'm gonna wind up overlapping over here. And so what I need to do is just go ahead and pin this so that I can work it and it'll be okay. I don't need to get super close so I don't have to pull that pin out later, but I just need to kind of hold it in place. So if you look from the back side, it's lined up to this point here, so that point all the way across. And so I just kind of have to hold this other piece out of my way because I don't want to hit the seam with this, because I don't want to go put a needle through this, because then it'll make a weird pucker and it'll just mess up my whole thing. So you just hold this out of the way. And this is also a point, I have been preaching that it doesn't really matter if you do back stitching and stuff because it's just going to wind up in the seam anyway. Well, Y seams are one of those cases where it probably is a really good idea to do a back stitch to secure this seam, because you're going to be fiddling with it a whole bunch and it's really easy to be able to accidentally pull that seam out. So doing a couple back stitches or a stay stitch, if you've got a newer machine that just automatically gives you a stay stitch, that will save you from having to redo that seam later once you've messed with it so much that it starts to fall out. So now what I'm going to do is just seam from here all the way down to that Y, and I'm going to stop right at that 1/4 inch mark that I put on there. Close to that pencil line, and I want to make sure that I know where this is so it stays out of the way, and I want to stop where that pencil intersects. And secure it there. So that's the first part of my Y. Now I've got this done. Now is the trickiest part. And that's because now I have to turn it around and do it on the other side. And so now I've got those lined up, and I've got to work this part that wants to still hold on in there. I need to get that out of my way so I don't put a needle through it too. So that's the point where all of that intersects. You only want to keep a needle going through 2 pieces of fabric, not 3 or a weird fold of 4 or 5. You just want to make sure that you're just securing these 2 fabrics to each other, so the blue and the lighter green on this one. So being the absolute last part of the seam, this is the one I really want to focus on making sure that I don't get a weird fold caught in the needle there. So now I'm going to go up. Again, I'm going to get right up to my 1/4 inch and be done. So because it's so big, this Y seam isn't that difficult. But you can see, like, I really need to go over that part of my seam again because it's starting to pull apart because I didn't stay stitch it well enough. And so I've pulled on it a little too much. So now I need to try that again and hopefully not pinch anything else in it. So I'm going to start from the intersection and go the other way. So let's see if I can do that without messing this up, because it looked pretty good except for that. Okay, I think I got it. I'll go ahead and finish the seam just because I don't really have to. Alright, so now let's see. So this Y seam's really good to practice on because it is so big. It's not as fiddly as some of the Y seams that you're going to run into. Because the smaller you get, of course, the harder it is to kind of keep everything out of the way and all of that sort of stuff. And what I'll do, I'll show you the back of how I ironed the other one. So that's my finished one there. I've got my Y and everything there. I actually went ahead and I used the square as my starting point for pressing down my seams. And so I've pressed the blue seam down that way and down this way. And then I just picked a direction for this and pushed it toward the darker edge. Now what that does is kind of give me a little bit extra bulk right here. This is not super ideal, but I felt like it wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. You can press the seam open and do it like this, and that will kind of distribute the points right there a little bit better. But I felt like this was okay. This is not too much bulk right there, and so it works fine. And so you'll want to just press it down and then you'll be done. So the key to the Y seam is marking those 1/4 of an inch and stopping right at your mark so that you're not crossing into another seam allowance, so that you can intersect all 3 of those parts of the seam and not cross into another seam allowance binding it up. And so just make sure you take your time, mark the corners that you need, and be sure that you slow down and really make sure that your needle lands right at that 1/4 mark, and that way these Y seams are not going to be that bad. So I hope that made sense, and I hope you feel like you can accomplish that without too much worry. And we're on to the drunkard's path, and it's going to be a challenge. So let's see how it goes.